At night, San Francisco sparkled with neon lights and jazz. The city was alive with music, temptation, and secrets. But behind closed doors, in discreet apartments tucked into ordinary neighborhoods, something far darker unfolded. A man steps into a living room decorated in velvet curtains and dim red lamps. A woman pours him a drink, her smile effortless, her perfume intoxicating. He doesn't know the wine glass is laced with LSD. And behind a hidden mirror, a CIA officer takes notes, sipping his martini. This wasn't a crime novel. This wasn't a film noir fantasy. This was reality. And it had a name. A CIA experiment that blurred the line between espionage and depravity. A project that recruited prostitutes, wired apartments, and laced drinks with drugs, all in the name of national security. It was one of the most amoral operations in intelligence history, and its story remained buried for decades. To understand Midnight Climax, we must step back to the early 1950s. The Cold War was heating up. The United States and the Soviet Union fought not just with bombs and rockets, but with ideas, spies, and shadows. In Washington, paranoia reigned. Politicians and generals feared that America was falling behind in a terrifying new arena, the human mind. Rumors spread that Soviet scientists were experimenting with brainwashing techniques, truth serums, and mind control drugs. When American prisoners of war in Korea began making confessions sympathetic to communism, the CIA panicked. Could the Soviets control human will? Could they program spies or assassins using drugs, hypnosis, or sex? The CIA's answer was brutal in its simplicity. If such tools existed, America had to master them first. This paranoia gave birth to Project MK-Ultra, the umbrella program for some of the most disturbing experiments in U.S. history. And hidden within its many sub-projects was a plan so outrageous it almost defies belief. That plan was Operation Midnight Climax. Every spy story has its eccentric characters. Midnight Climax had George Hunter White. White was no ordinary CIA officer. Before joining the agency, he had been a tough, flamboyant federal narcotics agent. He loved the world of undercover work. He loved danger. And above all, he loved power. He was known for his wild personality, chain-smoking cigars, drinking heavily, and boasting about his exploits. He lived like a character out of a pulp detective novel. And when MK-Ultra's masterminds needed someone ruthless enough to run an operation involving drugs, sex, and surveillance, White was their man. In 1955, White was given control of an experiment in San Francisco. The mission: set up safe houses disguised as brothels, hire prostitutes to lure men inside, secretly dose them with LSD, and observe their behavior. To White, this wasn't just intelligence work, it was a twisted game. The apartments chosen for Midnight Climax were decorated to seduce. Inside, the walls were lined with plush velvet. Erotic art and exotic lamps created an atmosphere of intimacy. Every detail was designed to lower a visitor's guard. But these weren't normal brothels. Hidden behind the walls were microphones, cameras, and, most famously, a large mirror that looked like a window. On one side, men seeking pleasure. On the other, George White and his CIA colleagues watching. The prostitutes were on the CIA payroll. Their role was simple: invite men back to the apartment, pour them a drink laced with LSD, and let the agency watch what happened. The subjects were often unsuspecting: businessmen, drifters, or simply unlucky citizens who thought they had found companionship for the night. They never signed a waiver. They never knew they were part of a government experiment. Why sex? The CIA believed that sexuality was one of the most powerful vulnerabilities of human beings. A person in the act of intimacy might reveal secrets they would otherwise guard. They might be more easily manipulated, coerced, or blackmailed. If LSD or other drugs were added to the mix, the effects could be even more dramatic. Could a drugged subject be made to confess? Could they be turned into an asset? Could they be programmed like a machine? Behind the one-way mirror, George White scribbled notes. He wrote about how subjects reacted, whether they became paranoid, talkative, or disoriented. Sometimes he even tested methods of interrogation, instructing prostitutes on how to ask leading questions while their clients were under the influence. In effect, these CIA safe houses became laboratories of human behavior. But unlike university psychology labs, there were no ethics boards, no consent forms, no boundaries, just sex, drugs, and surveillance. George White wasn't content with observation alone. He began hosting parties at the safe houses. Friends, fellow agents, and even unwitting strangers were invited. Drinks flowed freely. LSD was slipped into cocktails. Guests would laugh, flirt, and stumble through altered states, all while White took notes for the CIA. To him, this was a lifestyle. To the agency, it was data collection. The boundaries between experiment, entertainment, and exploitation disappeared. Years later, when White retired, he wrote a haunting line in his diary. "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun." Fun at the expense of human dignity. The success, or rather, the continuation, of Midnight Climax led to expansion. CIA safe houses were established not only in San Francisco but also in New York. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of men were secretly drugged and monitored. In some cases, prostitutes were instructed to extract information directly from their clients, a form of sexual espionage. In others, the goal was simply to observe how drugs like LSD altered behavior. The CIA collected thousands of pages of notes. But what did they learn? The answer is murky. LSD often produced unpredictable effects. Some subjects became paranoid, others euphoric, others violently ill. The idea of creating a truth serum or a mind-controlled spy proved elusive. Yet the agency persisted, driven less by scientific rigor than by fear of falling behind the Soviets. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't just unusual, it was a moral black hole. Think about it. A government agency sworn to protect the nation was drugging its own citizens without consent. It was recording their most intimate acts. It was weaponizing human sexuality for experiments that produced little concrete intelligence. The men who stumbled into these safe houses were not enemies of the state. They were ordinary people, used like lab rats. And the prostitutes, often women with few choices, became pawns in a game of manipulation. They were pressured to participate, promised payment and protection, but ultimately discarded. Behind the velvet curtains of San Francisco's secret apartments, the values of democracy were betrayed. And the worst part? The operation went on for nearly a decade. To outsiders, the CIA insisted that its mind control research was about science. They spoke of behavioral modification, psychochemical research, and interrogation techniques. But behind the polished words was something far less clinical. George White's notes didn't read like scientific papers. They read like the diary of a voyeur. He wrote about subjects under the influence while sipping gin and smoking cigars. He joked about guinea pigs who didn't know they were test subjects. The truth is, Operation Midnight Climax was never designed as a true experiment. There were no control groups, no standardized protocols, no rigorous methodology. It was chaos disguised as science. The CIA wasn't running laboratories, it was running peep shows. And the agency didn't seem to care. For them, the facade was enough. If Congress ever asked questions, they could wave around the language of national security and research. In reality, it was exploitation masquerading as intelligence. The safe houses were works of espionage theater. In San Francisco, one of the most notorious apartments was on Telegraph Hill, an ordinary building in a quiet neighborhood. Neighbors thought it was just another city apartment. Few imagined that inside, the CIA was running a secret operation. Hidden microphones were embedded in the walls. Cameras were disguised as home decor. Behind the mirrors, George White and his colleagues watched every movement. The prostitutes, recruited by White himself, were instructed to bring in men of interest. Some were simply random customers. Others were chosen because of their professions: politicians, businessmen, foreign visitors. The CIA wanted to know how different types of men behaved under the influence of LSD. Would they become reckless, confessional, violent? Sometimes the prostitutes were told to push conversations in specific directions. They might ask about work, about secrets, about politics. The idea was to see if a drugged subject could be persuaded to reveal sensitive information. It was espionage at its most intimate and most grotesque. The effects of LSD varied wildly. Some men collapsed into fits of laughter. Others became paranoid, convinced they were being watched. A few became aggressive, demanding explanations from the women who accompanied them. George White and his CIA colleagues found it fascinating. They took notes, recorded tapes, and cataloged behaviors, but the data was inconsistent. One night, a man might sing joyfully, declaring love for everyone in the room. Another night, a subject might curl into a ball, shivering with terror. The unpredictability of LSD was precisely why some scientists doubted its usefulness as a tool of interrogation. Yet, inside the safe houses, the CIA pressed on, ignoring the chaos. For White, it wasn't just about gathering information. It was about the thrill of control. Watching men unravel without knowing why gave him a sense of power. And in the morally void world of Midnight Climax, power was the only currency that mattered. The women who worked in the safe houses were not ordinary sex workers. They were employees of the CIA, though most never appeared on official payrolls. George White recruited them personally, promising money, protection, and, in some cases, a strange kind of patriotism. Some of the women were told they were helping fight communism, that by luring men into these apartments they were serving their country. Others didn't ask questions. They wanted cash, and White provided it. But the arrangement was hardly glamorous. Many of the women were pressured into situations they didn't fully understand. They were told to spike drinks, to extract information, to play roles far beyond ordinary sex work. When the men grew violent or unstable under LSD, the women were often left to manage the chaos. The CIA watched from behind mirrors, rarely intervening. To the agency, the prostitutes were tools, just like the men they seduced. As the operation expanded, the line between experiment and sadism blurred. George White himself seemed increasingly intoxicated by the power. He decorated the safe houses with bizarre, almost cartoonish flair, exotic paintings, mirrored walls, and lurid furniture. He wanted the rooms to feel like dens of sin. White often bragged about his role. To friends, he hinted at wild parties and unbelievable experiments. Few believed him. His stories sounded too outrageous. But inside the CIA, there were concerns. Some officers wondered whether Midnight Climax had gone too far. They questioned the lack of scientific rigor, the ethical vacuum, the reckless abuse of LSD. Yet the project continued, because in the Cold War, fear silenced doubts. The specter of Soviet mind control hung over Washington like a cloud. And as long as that fear persisted, the CIA would fund almost anything. Even apartments where sex and drugs mixed with surveillance. By the late 1950s, Midnight Climax expanded beyond San Francisco. In New York City, CIA safe houses popped up in Greenwich Village and other neighborhoods. Just like in California, prostitutes lured men inside, LSD was slipped into drinks, and hidden microphones captured every word. The New York operations were even more secretive. The city was a hub for diplomats, businessmen, and foreign visitors. The CIA hoped to target individuals who might have valuable intelligence or vulnerabilities that could be exploited later. The mix of sex, drugs, and espionage created a volatile environment. Some men confessed secrets under the influence. Others rambled incoherently. Still others became violent, leaving chaos in their wake. But again, the agency persisted. The more questions arose about morality, the more the CIA doubled down on secrecy. It is easy to forget how little oversight the CIA faced in the 1950s. There were no intelligence committees in Congress, no watchdog agencies, no journalists digging into secret budgets. The CIA operated in near total darkness, answering only to a handful of officials in the White House. That secrecy allowed projects like Midnight Climax to flourish. Money flowed freely, hidden in classified budgets. Reports were vague, filled with jargon that obscured the truth. And George White? He thrived in the shadows. He had the authority to run operations with almost no accountability. He could rent apartments, recruit prostitutes, and drug civilians, all with government approval. To him, it must have felt like absolute power, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what did Midnight Climax actually achieve? The CIA hoped to discover whether LSD could function as a truth serum. They wanted to know if it could break down psychological defenses, making subjects more compliant. But the results were inconclusive. Sometimes men revealed secrets. Other times, they simply rambled nonsense. LSD was unpredictable, inconsistent, and uncontrollable. In practice, the safe houses produced more entertainment than science. White's notes were filled with colorful anecdotes but little usable data. Years later, one CIA officer admitted, "The real product of Midnight Climax was George White's voyeurism. It was never science. It was theater." The CIA had built brothels, drugged citizens, and violated countless lives, all for results that amounted to little more than drunken observations. Yet the program persisted for years. Because once a secret operation is in motion, it rarely stops on its own. Not everyone in the CIA was comfortable. By the early 1960s, some officers whispered concerns about the legality and morality of the operation. They worried that if it was ever exposed, the scandal would be catastrophic. But those voices were drowned out. The culture of secrecy and fear silenced dissent. And George White himself dismissed critics. In his eyes, the world was divided between the hunters and the hunted. He believed he was doing what was necessary to protect America, and if that meant drugging and exploiting citizens, so be it. In truth, he was protecting nothing but his own thrill for power. But in the CIA of the Cold War, that was enough to keep the safe houses running. As the 1960s unfolded, LSD escaped the shadows of the CIA and entered mainstream culture. Writers, artists, and musicians began experimenting with the drug. It became a symbol of counterculture, of rebellion, of freedom. The CIA, ironically, had helped spread the very substance it once hoped to weaponize. Some of the earliest supplies of LSD in America came directly from agency-funded research. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, George White's safe houses continued, but they were no longer cutting edge. To many in the agency, they seemed like relics of an earlier era. Still, the operation persisted, partly because no one wanted to shut it down, and partly because secrecy made it easy to ignore. It would take another decade before the truth began to emerge, and when it did, the revelations would shock the nation. By the early 1970s, America was changing. The Vietnam War had shaken trust in government. Journalists were digging deeper, and Congress was beginning to demand accountability from the intelligence agencies. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal unfolded, CIA Director Richard Helms made a fateful decision. He ordered the destruction of files related to MK-Ultra, including Operation Midnight Climax. It was an act of desperation, a way to erase the paper trail of one of the most amoral operations in agency history. But not everything was destroyed. A few boxes of financial records and memoranda survived, and when investigators began asking questions, the outlines of Midnight Climax emerged. In 1975, the U.S. Senate launched the Church Committee, a sweeping investigation into intelligence abuses. For the first time, the public heard whispers of CIA safe houses, prostitutes on payroll, and citizens drugged without consent. The revelation stunned the nation. Senators were horrified. One called it a story of perversion and corruption, not science. But because so many files had been destroyed, the full scale of Midnight Climax was never documented. We are left with fragments, testimonies, expense sheets, and George White's flamboyant diaries. The truth was more outrageous than fiction, and yet impossible to fully reconstruct. George White retired in the 1960s, long before the scandal broke. He died in 1975, the same year the church committee hearings began. In one of his final letters, he reflected on his career. It was not an apology. "I was a soldier," he wrote. "I did what was asked. I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, 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 fun." That was how he described years of violating the rights and dignity of unsuspecting men and women. To the end, George White never expressed regret. And perhaps that is the most chilling part of all. Today, Operation Midnight Climax feels like a surreal footnote in Cold War history. A government that swore to defend freedom built brothels, hired prostitutes, and drugged its own citizens, all in pursuit of a weapon that never existed. The operation produced no miracle truth serum, no mind-controlled spies, no reliable methods of interrogation. What it did produce was a legacy of mistrust. A reminder that secrecy and power, left unchecked, can corrode morality. And a question that lingers. If this is what we discovered decades later, what remains hidden still? Imagine the men who stumbled into those apartments, believing they had found a night of pleasure, only to become subjects in an experiment they would never know existed. Imagine the women pressured into serving as instruments of espionage. They were not volunteers. They were victims, and the government that used them left behind only shadows. Operation Midnight Climax is more than a bizarre tale of sex and spies. It is a warning, a reminder that in the pursuit of power, even the most trusted institutions can lose their way. So the next time you hear the words national security, remember the velvet-curtained apartments of San Francisco and New York. And remember that sometimes the greatest dangers are not foreign enemies, but what governments will do when no one is watching. What do you think? Was Operation Midnight Climax the CIA's darkest secret, or just the tip of the iceberg? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories.